Hi, thanks for tuning in to episode 2 of Desert Euphonies. This is Joel. Today I'd like to take a quick look at the history of the Jewish community in Medina. Something that surprised me when I was doing my reading for this channel was that the Jewish community of Medina was not just a couple of tribes that Muhammad had a falling out with at a particular point in his career, but in fact was a community with roots several centuries deep in Arabia, and that they had attained a level of physical prosperity as well as respect for their religious beliefs from the pagan population. They also had achieved a degree of political power, being the client kings for the Persians, collecting taxes and ruling on their behalf as part of a proxy war with the Christian Byzantine Empire. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. I should also say at the beginning of the video that there was also a thriving Jewish community in Yemen, which will be the subject for another video. It's not something that we're really going to be looking at closely here. So to get started, I'd like to describe two legends that were told about the Jewish community of Medina to describe their origins as well as to justify the place in society that they had. Now, what's interesting is even though Arabia was overwhelmingly pagan, these stories revolve around at least a familiarity with the Jewish religion, with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the first legend is that when God led the Jews out of Egypt during the Exodus, according to the biblical narrative, they were commanded on their way to wipe out a tribe called the Amalekites, who were basically the villains of the story when the Jews were moving into Canaan. Now, according to the biblical narrative, the Jews do go ahead and they wipe out this population. But in the telling in Arabian folklore, the Jews actually disobey their commandment from God and allow the Amalekite king's son to survive and to flee unharmed. As a divine punishment for this disobedience, God sends the Jews to wander through the desert a second time, this time wandering through Arabia until they eventually find themselves along the coast in the Hijaz, the region of the cities of Mecca and Medina, which had been the Amalekite kingdom. The Jews settle in Medina, or as it was known at the time, the city of Yathrib, for a period of time. Now, eventually, God lifts this punishment, and a large number of the Jews do eventually make it to the Promised Land, but some decide to stick around and see how well they can do on their own. These Jews do find a level of prosperity and a level of religious esteem with the general population that they become known to the Arabs as the Al-Kahinin. Supposedly descended from an individual named Al-Kahin, who was a priest, the son of Aaron, the brother of Moses. They were called the two priestly tribes, the Banu al-Nadir and the Banu Qurayza, who were the dominant Jews of Medina during Muhammad's career. Now, there is a second legend that was popular with the Arabs shortly before Muhammad began his career, describing three Jewish tribes, the Banu al-Nadir, the Banu Qurayza, and also a third Jewish tribe in Medina called the Banu Badal. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing those. I looked it up on Google. I think that's how it's pronounced. Anyway, the story in this telling is that the Jews actually arrived much, much, much later. That they arrived in Arabia sometime in the 1st century following the Roman destruction of the Jewish community in Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, from what I've read, it seems as though this particular telling was more preferred by the Jews in Medina because it really stressed their nobility of coming from that Jewish community that existed prior to the Roman destruction. Now, those are interesting legends, and it would be really, really cool if there was anything confirming either of those stories because they're both pretty compelling narratives. But As far as the historical record it goes, it's really unclear how the Jews made their way into Arabia. The earliest record of any kind linking the Jews to Arabia comes to us from the middle of the 6th century BCE. There's a small tablet of clay called the Prayer of Nabonidus, and it's written about the king of Babylon either invading the Hijaz with a small number of Jews accompanying him, or during the invasion, developing a malady with his eye and seeing a Jewish mystic who had already been living there to cure his ailment. That's really all we have to go on for the next 5 centuries. The first time we get a really clear historical picture of there being a Jewish community in Arabia comes to us during the Jewish revolt against Rome, which went from 132 to 135 CE. The Jewish spiritual leader of this revolt, Rabbi Akiva, we know journeyed to Arabia to gather support from the Jewish community that was there. In the 3rd century CE, a Christian missionary named Theophilus traveled to Arabia as well, where he wrote that he had found many Jewish communities there. Now, I know I said I was not going to really go into the history of the Jewish community of Yemen, but I just want to say as a side note, this is the first time that we start seeing historically evidence of a Jewish community or Jewish influence in Yemen. Their religious inscriptions are either directly Jewish or at least heavily based on Jewish tradition. So it's really in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE that historians can say, okay, looking at Arabia, now there is a Jewish community there. And increasingly over the centuries, as the prestige and political influence of the Jewish community in Medina increases, they become much more clearly known to history until finally the Islamic Revolution and that history begins. The glory days of the Jewish community in Medina begins in the 5th century CE. Two of the Jewish tribes, the Banu Qurayza and the Banu al-Nadir, were key players in the Byzantine-Persian proxy war across Arabia. In the 5th century, there were the two great powers in the Middle East, the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Sasanian Persian Empire. And they were fighting a war pretty similar to the Cold War between Russia and America, in the sense that they had lots of proxy powers as far south as Ethiopia and Yemen, fighting small battles on their behalf, playing a game of chess for control of the whole Middle East. For example, the Yemeni Jewish community was on the side of the Persians and were fighting against the Ethiopian Christian kingdom, which was on the side of the Byzantines. Now, in Medina, the Persians were using the Jewish community as their proxy. One of their jobs was to collect taxes on the Persian behalf from the peoples across the Hijaz. So this Jewish prosperity and political privilege continues for several decades until eventually the Byzantine-Persian conflict becomes so destructive that it causes trade across Arabia to collapse, just plummeting the Jewish influence and prosperity in Medina. The Arab merchants, Jews, Christian, and pagan, relied on long-distance trade in luxury goods such as silk. So as the military conflict messes with that trade route, everyone's fortunes just hit rock bottom. So I'd like to take a moment and just step back and explain a little bit about what life was like for the Jewish Arabs. First of all, you'll notice I'm not saying Jews and Arabs, which is something that you'll hear a lot in the 20th century. I mean, they're called the Arab-Israeli Wars, right? At this particular point in time in history, the Jews were absolutely Arab. Geographically, you could find them anywhere. You would see Jews among the Bedouin nomads, among rural farmers, and Arab elites. There were Jewish clans among the Arabs, and there were many Jewish clans with at least some members who were also Jewish. Vocationally, they were as mixed as the wider Arab population. You would find Jewish and non Jewish Arabs being poets, being mystics, healers, farmers, bandits, and merchants. Jewish society was respected by many pagan Arabs. An interesting subject for a later video would be the kind of envy that the general Arab population had toward Christians, Jews, and Persian Zoroastrians. There was this idea among many Arabs that the Jews had received their revelation through Moses, the Greeks had received their revelation through Jesus, the Persians had received their revelation through Zarathustra, and the Arabs got camels and desert and cacti. So what ends up happening in the period of time before Muhammad is a lot of these Arabs start to incorporate a lot of the monotheistic religious traditions into themselves. For example, there was a belief that developed among the Arabs themselves that they had descended from Ishmael. It was a way of integrating themselves into the religious cultures of these much more sophisticated, prosperous, and ancient empires. So the Jews had a great deal of respect, and a lot of their religious ideas entered common parlance. For example, the Quran, from what I understand, is said to have been written in a pure kind of Arabic that was spoken at the time. But in that Arabic, you're going to find a lot of Jewish terms. For example, one of the terms that's mentioned in the Quran is karaka. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. I don't know Arabic or Hebrew. But it comes from the Hebrew word tzedakah, which is a Jewish religious term meaning charity and righteousness. The Arab term nabi comes from the Hebrew term navi, which refers to a prophet. The term zakat, which is a commandment in Islam, comes from the Hebrew zahut, which means purification or merit. Again, apologize if I'm mispronouncing. I read a lot, but I don't know many people who speak Hebrew or Arabic, unfortunately. But what I've read, the sources do point to a lot of Jewish religious ideas being pulled into the general Arab culture. There are also cases of conversion that happened between pagan Arabs and Judaism. This happens a lot of the time individually. Individual pagan Arabs convert. There was a tradition among some pagan Arab mothers to make a vow such that if their child survives their infancy, they would see that child converted into Judaism. There were also cases of the conversion of whole pagan Arab tribes into Judaism. Now, part of that had to do with the pagan Arab respect for Jewish religious culture, but part of that also had to do with just the nuts and bolts of life in the desert. A lot of the urban centers were predominantly Jewish communities. And at the time, the lines of tribe and religion and systems of patronage and economic, social, and political power were all entwined. So when pagan Arab nomads wanted to migrate into these towns for pretty mundane secular reasons having to do with the flow of money and power and social privilege and prestige and so on, they would convert entirely when they would go through the city gates. So I just want to really emphasize the kind of intermixing that goes on between the Jews, the Jewish Arabs, and the pagan Arabs, religiously, economically, socially. It's not like today where, there's that iron wall separating the two communities. At this point in time in Arabia, it's much more fluid between pagan and Jewish Arabs. Now, That said, it's kind of interesting to ask, well, what would the Judaism of these Arabs have looked like? The cultural capitals of the Jewish world at this point are in Palestine and Babylonia. And while Medina is certainly not, quote unquote, barbarian territory, it's not exactly the center of high Jewish civilization and culture either. Because of this, we don't really have a lot of literary sources that come from the Jewish community itself in Medina describing its practices and identity. Instead, the sources that historians rely on are from advice that was given by the rabbinic community in Palestine to the Jews of Medina, and also certain descriptions in the Quran and the early Islamic sources describing that community as well. So, early Islamic sources divide the Jewish community into two different classes. The first is basically the social elite. These are those who are literate, who are scholarly in their approach to religion, and it really refers to the elites in Medina. The term that the early Muslims use for this community is arabian, which is the same term that was used to describe the Jewish scholars in the great academies of Babylonia. The second definition of the Jewish community that the early Muslims had referred to the lesser Jews of the small towns, of the rural countryside. These were people who did not have that scholarly acumen, may not have been literate at all, but really took to heart the guidelines of Jewish ritual purity, Jewish ritual practice, and adhered very, very closely to the laws laid out having to do with agricultural activity. Now, from the sources in the Midrash, we know that the Jews were also in conversation with the academies in Palestine. The way the Jewish world was set up at the time is you would have all of the Jewish diaspora communities, whether they're in Spain or Arabia or wherever they are, anywhere in the world, that would not have the education to really know how to navigate the intricacies of Jewish law. So what they would do is they would write the great academies of Palestine or Babylonia, and they would say, we have this particular tricky matter of inheritance, or we have this particular question of ritual purity, or what have you. Can you please shed some light on this particular matter for us? So they would write the academies. The academies would take their time, analyze the situation, have a scholarly debate, look at the various religious sources, and write an advice back to that particular community. And a lot of these records of conversation that happened between the Jewish diaspora and the academies is a really good source to understand what was happening in the Jewish world. So the Jews of Medina seem to have been very keenly interested in understanding issue of kosher dietary regulations, of wondering whether or not their women should be wearing a veil, as well, and this is interesting, whether it's permissible from a kosher perspective to dwell in a camel hair tent, which seems to say that they had assimilated to a fair amount in the same lifestyle as the other Arab nomads, but they still wanted to make sure that that activity was happening within an acceptable Jewish context. Now, that said, because they were distant from the heartland of the Jewish community, they had developed various little heterodox quirks that were not at all acceptable to the Jewish mainstream. For example, a lot of Arabian Jews believed that God had to operate within certain limits. Others had developed the idea that Ezra was the human son of God, which is an idea maybe as close to blasphemy as Judaism can get. They had also, being part of a common Arab conversation, developed certain generalized Arab obsessions: magic, mysticism, eschatological end of times thinking, things that go along with the time of general economic and social anxiety following the cataclysmic wars between the Byzantines and Persians, the Jewish Arabs shared with the pagan Arabs. All right, so that's a quick overview of what's going on in the Arabian Jewish community prior to the development of Islam. I know I said in my first episode that we would be looking at the exilarchs in the Abbasid period, but there is just so much groundwork that I'm going to need to do before we can get to looking at the exilarchs and their conflict with the religious scholars. Probably next week we're going to be taking a more general look at Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian history in the Middle East in antiquity. And then we're going to start looking at the development of the Jewish world within the context of Islamic history and civilization. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.